Welcome to today's presentation, How to Implement Apple in Healthcare. My name is Nick Thompson and I will be your host for today's presentation. Let's take a look at the agenda. So we're going to do a brief overview here first of what is the Casper Suite, since not everybody is familiar with our product here. Then we're going to dive into why Apple for healthcare. Why are healthcare organizations deciding to choose Apple products? We'll then explore three ways about how healthcare organizations are implementing these devices. First, securing devices to meet regulatory standards. Then, ways to transform the bedside experience, and how to ensure secure clinical communications via apps. And of course, we'll wrap up with Q&A. Okay, let's dive into an overview of the Casper Suite here. First off, we are Jamf software, and our mission is to help organizations succeed with Apple. In fact, we've been managing Apple products now here since 2002, long before they were really popular in any sort of healthcare or enterprise deployment scenarios here. And how do we do that? Well, we do it with our main product. Our main product is called the Casper Suite. And the Casper Suite is a set of administrative tools to help you manage your Apple devices. At the heart of the suite is something called the JSS, or the Jamf software server. That's really the management server component. It also includes a set of apps that run natively on the Mac, and these apps are used for doing package building and remote access and imaging, as well as a number of other things. I'm not going to touch too much on these, but you should just know that these are part of the suite. Now, this JSS, or again, the Jamf software server, really is just it's a web server, and it communicates to your devices all over the internet. So that means you can host this JSS either on your own server, if you want to run it on a Mac or a Windows or a Linux server. But of course, we offer cloud hosting as well too, which is probably the easiest way to get this implemented here. Now, a little history for you, since we love supporting Apple's operating systems. If you kind of look back here, Mac OS X has evolved a lot over the past 15 years. And of course, you add on top of that iOS, where you have this annual release cycle that iOS has been seeing. Plus, you now have operating systems that run on our watches and on our TVs. Well, we here at Jamf, we love supporting all of this stuff, and so every major release of Apple's operating systems, we've released a new version of the Casper Suite to support all those great new features. So if you're looking for an Apple management tool, you want to make sure that they are supporting Apple's operating system updates, and we've been doing that really since the beginning here. Okay. So why Apple now for healthcare? We've seen a big surgence of Apple products in the enterprise and in education, but why is healthcare looking at Apple products here? Well, we want to focus on iOS. iOS is probably one of the more popular platforms that healthcare organizations are choosing. And so why are they choosing this? Well, it's because they have some of the best and most efficient mobile hardware on the market here. Apple builds their own chipsets, those A-series chips, and they are just extremely efficient and very fast. There's native hardware-based encryption built into these devices as well too. So all you need is a password on them, and hardware encryption is on there to keep your data secure. Especially if you're dealing with private information like client or patient information, you want to make sure that it's secure. Apple also has built-in support for Touch ID. So if you're using Touch ID now, which is their fingerprint scanner, to log into apps or to just log into the device itself, it makes it that much more secure. Of course, there's a wide range of apps now that are supported on these devices, from productivity like Microsoft Office to access to clinical communication apps and to medical health record apps as well. There's built-in support for all the modern wireless networking that's needed to have a secure environment, such as VPN and single sign-on. And of course, if you're using any sort of email access, well, it's got built-in support for Microsoft Exchange and all other sort of popular mail clients out there. Now, you may be asking yourself, well, what about Android? And, Google's Android operating system, of course, has risen in popularity. But there's a few factors about Android that, we here at Jamf don't believe is best suited for an industry like healthcare. And the first reason why we say that is because of its fragmentation. This is a graph of the iOS adoption rates and the Android adoption rates for the latest operating systems. On the left, we can see that iOS 8 and iOS 9 really comprises a vast majority of the users that are running iOS. That's because it's very easy to upgrade. And we know that security comes through having the most up-to-date operating system. Now, on the Android side, we see that only about 30% are running the newest versions of the operating system, with Marshmallow just a very, very tiny sliver out, and that's their newest version, running Android there. So we see some potential security risks if you're choosing to go with Android over iOS. Another big thing is, well, there are security concerns about Android. They've had to recently battle some mobile viruses and malware, frankly, because Google has very minimal review in their app store. So nefarious developers have been known to sort of upload these apps that look like very popular ones, and once they're downloaded, they actually steal some data. And so the presence of all this kind of makes it a very big security risk for an organization that needs to really consider data like patient data. All right, so we here at Jamf, we think that iOS is really the way to go if you are truly serious about security. All right, so how do we secure these devices now to meet the industry regulations that are out there? Well, to learn about this, I want to touch on something called mobile device management, or MDM. Anytime that you have a device that's enrolled into the Casper Suite, it communicates to something called the Apple Push Notification Server, or APNS for short. Now, the APNS maintains a constant connection to your devices so you don't have to. In this case, the iPad here communicates back to our JSS, and it receives any sort of commands that we send it, any apps, or any profiles. That is the architecture that's known as MDM, or Mobile Device Management. Now, for the Mac side of things, we can do the same thing on the Mac with MDM, but we also install an agent on a Mac that lets us do some really interesting things like running scripts and installing packages. And we call that a policy inside of the JSS. I'm not going to focus too much on the Mac today, just because we see that iOS being the most popular devices here in the healthcare industry. But you should just know that the Casper Suite can do some really cool things with the Mac. Now, you may be asking yourself, okay, great, what can MDM really do? Well, MDM lets you do a lot of great things. It lets you help streamline your deployments. It will gather extensive inventory data on all your devices. It will configure all your settings, and you can send commands to these devices to take action on them. You can, of course, deploy apps, and you can make sure that all your devices are secure. So with this framework in mind, I'm going to walk through, how can MDM really meet your security standards that you have as a healthcare organization. So first off, you're going to want to use what we call configuration profiles to deploy security settings to devices. What is a configuration profile? For those who are out there that are a little more technical, it's really just an XML file that gets put onto the device, and it defines the security settings. You can do really great things like, say, have it automatically join your secure Wi-Fi network, or have it pre-populate the VPN settings that you need for them to connect to your secure network. You can disable some of the consumer features, such as disabling iCloud or adding personal accounts on there. If you have patient data on these devices, you don't want somebody being able to add their personal Gmail account and then potentially leaking data that way. You can do other things too, such as disabling the camera or the App Store altogether so that users can't get access to any sort of third-party apps. And you can enable supervision on these devices. And what supervision is, it's just a higher level of management that's available for iPads. Okay, so after we've got our security settings deployed to these devices, you want to then monitor them. And you want to set up any sort of alerts for non-compliant devices. And that's what the Casper Suite can help you do. So inventory data is gathered and sent back to the MDM server. And it's a lot of great information about these devices. It will tell us like the serial number, the IP address. It'll show us like the battery level on it. But it also shows things like a list of all apps installed on there and any sort of profiles that are installed on there. And you can set up what's known as smart groups that are searching for various criteria that says, show me all devices that don't have a password on them. And you can then have alerts alert you that says, this device is out of compliance. So what do you do then if you find devices that are not compliant? Well, you can take action on them. And you can take action on them using management commands. So here's a screenshot of our JSS. Again, the management server component of the Casper Suite. And we see that we have a couple of commands at our disposal. And one of them is like wiping the device. So you could take action on these infringing devices using these remote commands. So MDM really helps you throughout this entire process of securing these devices, monitoring them, and being able to take any sort of action. Now, some additional security details that you should know about. First off, no patient data is actually transmitted back or stored into the MDM server. So you can rest assured that any sort of patient data that's on that device is not transferred back to the MDM server. Next, iOS includes a lot of great built-in tools that just make these devices so much more secure. We mentioned earlier it has built-in encryption on there, and encryption is automatically turned on as long as you have a passcode enabled. So that's why it's very important to use a configuration profile to enforce a passcode. Of course, has support for all the great VPN protocols that are available and Touch ID. You can also generate reports inside of the JSS to demonstrate your compliance. So usually when it comes to audit time, they'll ask you, okay, show me, prove to me that all of your devices are compliant. All of your devices require a passcode. You can easily generate these kind of reports inside of the JSS that will show a list of your devices and a list of compliance on there. Now, another thing that you'd probably want to do with iPads if you're deploying them is you want to standardize the settings of these things. So here we have an example iPad, and we've done some pretty interesting things to this, all using configuration profiles. So what have we done? Well, we've used a profile to set the wallpaper of the device so that it has a standardized wallpaper. We have deployed our self-service app on here. And what self-service is, it's an app that's part of the Casper Suite. That's really like your internal app store. So users can get approved apps all in one spot. We've also hidden some of the unnecessary system apps that we don't want our users to see. For example, we don't have like the photo booth app on here. We don't have the camera. We don't have the contacts app. All of those have been hidden by the system because we want this to be just a device for our medical professionals here. We've then deployed third-party apps to these devices, and we've done so without Apple IDs, which is possible, and I'll talk about a little bit later. And we've deployed web clips onto this iPad here, and web clips are just like a quick bookmark to access internal websites or any website that you want. In this case, we have the HR link here. And we've defined the home screen layout, including any folders on this device or the dock. So when a nurse picks this up, we know that it's the same one across all of our devices. Okay, So now that we've talked about how do we secure these devices, we want to talk about the bedside experience as well, because we think this is something that iPads plus an MDM tool will be able to really transform. So first off, what makes a good bedside experience for patients? Well, it's a number of different things. First off, it's an easy setup of these devices by the caregivers. You don't want them messing around with all sorts of IT controls when they're supposed to be focusing on patients. So we think it's very paramount to have an easy setup of these devices, and we got a pretty great solution for that. You also need access to your electronic medical records data, and that's going to be in the form of a lot of apps now. We also see streamlining communications into these apps now, and we see it as a potential for providing patients with education and entertainment on these devices too. Plus, you probably want to conduct surveys, and so we'll show you some survey solutions here too. And when you have a patient that checks out and you need to then give the iPad to a new patient, you want to make sure that these iPads are sort of digitally sterilized. We sterilize all the other things inside the room. We want to make sure that these devices are sterilized as well too. All right, so how do we handle the setup of devices? Well, there's really 3 ways to set up an iPad, and I'm gonna really just focus on one of these ways here today. And I'm not gonna talk about the first 2, but the third one here is called Device Enrollment Program, or DEP. And what DEP allows you to do is it allows you to take an iPad that is at its factory state, and as it boots up for the very first time, it's going to be automatically enrolled. And it's going to make it really easy for a caregiver to get it set up. So let me show you what that process would look like here. So here's our iPad booting up for the very first time, and it's entering the setup assistant, the familiar, choose your language and choose your region. Now it needs to connect to Wi-Fi for this to work. And that's why we recommend having some sort of like guest network just for enrollment. And then you can push down a profile that has it join the more secure Wi-Fi network later on. Or you could use cellular devices too to skip that altogether. The iPad is then flagged for enrollment, and it will automatically receive then instructions that say this iPad needs to be enrolled, and users cannot skip this step whatsoever. They just simply tap next. It then downloads the MDM profile onto the device, and you can have it skip a lot of the common setup screens that you see there, like the Apple ID screen or the terms and conditions screen. Now the iPad is then enrolled and it's ready for management. So we've got this kind of blank iPad at factory state, but of course, we don't want it to be like this. We want to hide some of these system apps, and we want to apply our security profiles here. So we do that, and this all automatically happens after enrollment. So we apply our profiles, we apply our apps, and we apply our security settings, and it's now the iPad that we want our users to have. And it meets all of our security standards here. So that's great. Now, how do we handle some of these apps? Access to EMR data is really important. And what's great is these popular EMR vendors out there, kind of like Epic, which I'm showing here, are now offering iPad apps that will securely access patient data. All you need to do is just deploy them onto the device and preload some configuration settings with them too. And this is what you end up with, is a really great way for patients to have access to kind of what's going on in terms of their stay. No more do you have to look at that whiteboard that's written on there kind of in code about what's happening. Patients can have access to really detailed information in a really easy to use way. Now you can also deploy apps on these devices for education and entertainment purposes. On the left here we see an iPad that has an interactive iBook on there, and you could load up other reference materials that are related to that patient's injury. And that can all be preloaded using the iBooks app. Of course, you can deploy other apps out there for popular apps for entertainment use for the patient too. If you're looking at surveys, this is a popular survey app done by a company called Tonic Health. And it's really nice because you can also deploy this app on there. You could also send a command to have this app be brought up to the front and can't be exited out using single app mode. And this way you can conduct your survey at the end of the patient's stay, and they can get all the great information and provide feedback on their stay all through the Tonic Health app. Now, when a patient is done, you of course want to digitally sterilize these devices. So how do you do that? Well, I'm going to take you back here to that DEP enrollment that we saw earlier. So these are how the iPads would start off, for a new patient. We then have it be automatically enrolled, and all of the device settings are pushed down to the device so that we have a nice fresh iPad. But then when a patient checks out, what do? Well, you send a remote command for it to be automatically wiped. That will wipe everything that is on that data, or on that device, all of the data. And it will then be brought back to that setup screen. So you can see how this cycle will play out in between every single patient that you'd have. So it would be really easy to just simply hand, or have a nurse grab a new iPad. They quickly go through those setup screens. They have all the data that they need right there. Maybe the patient is using it for their stay, and once they check out, well, you just send a command to these devices that will wipe it and then bring it back to that easy to set up state at the beginning here. So we see this as a really big potential for healthcare providers to be able to either have nurses use these iPads in between each patient, or to have patients have an iPad at their bedside to really transform that experience here. All right, now our next topic. I want to talk about deploying these apps here, and specifically for secure clinical communications. So what you need to know about apps and MDM are a few things. I want to cover those here. So the first thing that you need to know about apps with MDM is the Volume Purchase Program, or known as VPP. Now, this is Apple's program that lets you buy apps in bulk. And what's important to know about this is that you can do so in a way where you will retain ownership of these apps, and that they're not actually transferred to the user's Apple ID, but rather they will be licenses owned by the organization. Now, the other thing that you should know about apps here is that once you deploy an app using MDM, it becomes managed. And by managed, it means that you have app-level control over this stuff. You can pre-configure settings, and you can control the flow of app data in here. So how does this all work? Well, first off, I'm going to buy licenses via the VPP store. And those licenses are then transferred into the MDM server, in this case, of course, the Casper Suite. And then we're going to choose to assign these either to the user itself, to their Apple ID, or we're going to choose to assign them to devices directly. And so if these are shared devices, we're probably going to choose the method of deploying them directly to the devices. If these are, like say a doctor's personal iPhone, or if it's kind of a more individual one, then you might want to go down the route of the Apple ID. Next, we're going to load in some pre-configurations here. And app configurations are great because you can do things like auto-configure the URLs or any sort of like license keys that needs to have on there. You can restrict them from running on non-secure devices. You can tunnel the connectivity through VPN of the app, and you can also enable single sign-on in all of these. Now, all these features are dependent on the app itself. So if the app developer doesn't support them, you need to ask that they do, essentially. And there's a great website that will that consolidates all this data together called appconfig.org. So if you want to know if your app supports some of these configurations, you can go to appconfig.org to look at them. So how would this work? Well, again, we get our licenses. We then load our configurations into the MDM server, and then when I deploy them again, either to the user or to the devices, those apps, those managed apps, are transferred over with pre-configured settings in there. So that means when I launch great apps that are designed for clinical communications, the caregivers don't have to set up anything on their own. Everything is just pre-configured for them. They don't have to enter in, the URLs or anything like that. It will just open up. And these are some great examples of clinical communication apps that are out there on the market by Volte, Vocera, and Praxify. All of them are designed to enable communications between nurses and doctors and to be able to send critical information to each other all while on the fly. So using an MDM server, you will be able to take apps like these, pre-configure them, and deploy them to the devices, all without needing their Apple IDs on there and without needing any sort of pre-configured settings. It makes clinical communications a breeze because these apps are really great, and using them on the platform of iPhone and iPad are really wonderful to have. All right, so to recap now here. A lot of this that we talked about today, of course, was framed up using the MDM framework. Again, what we discussed here is all sorts of different aspects around MDM and how this really enables you to implement Apple inside of your healthcare organization. For deployment, that was really that DEP portion, automating those enrollment actions. And that will reduce the kind of quote-unquote IT tasks that are required of nurses or doctors, because you don't want them focusing on that kind of stuff. You want it to be as automated as possible. And with DEP, you can do that. Inventory, of course, we collect device inventory only, not patient data, and you monitor for any sort of security compliance issues. The profiles, you deploy the profiles onto the devices for any sort of security settings and any special use cases that you might have. Again, with setting the wallpaper or arranging the apps in a certain way how you want them to. Those management tasks, if you need to take action on a specific device that's out of compliance, such as remotely wiping it, or if you're remotely wiping it in between each patient, that's what that does. And of course, deploying apps that are pre-configured to the devices themselves, all while making sure that you're mitigating any sort of risk related to HIPAA compliance or any sort of industry compliance that you need to be aware of. So really what happens here is with the Casper Suite as your MDM, plus iPads, plus a wealth of great apps that are being developed here, you end up with secure devices, a really unique bedside experience for your patients, and a platform for secure communications. So what's next here? As some next steps, I'd highly recommend that you reach out to us, contact us on our website, go to jamfsoftware.com. We would love to chat with you about your specific environment. We've got sales and engineers folks across the US and the globe that would love to chat with you further. If you want to learn more about some of these specific features, if you want to go deeper into DEP, or if you want to go deeper into iOS management or Mac management, we've got great webinars for that. And I'd highly recommend that you check out our community forum. It's called Jamf Nation. We've got over 35,000 members now on this, where they are all sharing their best practices for how they manage Macs and iPads. And you can learn a lot just from asking and reading about posts from the community here. So with that, I want to thank everybody, and that concludes the presentation. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to us. Thanks. Have a great day.